Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our panel on maps, monuments, and museums. We have a wonderful panel for you. It looks like at this stage we only have two of our panelists present, but we're expecting Andrew Anderson to join us later. Let me just say a few words, if I may. You all know that the program on Georgian studies has been active for 3 semesters now, and one of the important parts of our program is having these regular panels from people in the field focused on particular topics, and this one is a very important one. History is always extremely important to the present. It's not something that we can quietly forget about. It's something that clearly has an impact on politics in the present. Since independence in 1991, successive Georgian governments have promoted a Georgian history which emphasizes themes of national self-preservation, unity, sacrifice, cultural uniqueness, and European belonging. Yet Georgian history is still incomplete. Its past is often absent. If in the Soviet period the history of 1918 to 21 was erased, in the 2000s, the history of Soviet Georgia still remains largely unexamined. History and memory remain contested around national figures and monuments, around maps and frontiers, and around the proper representation of Georgian history in museums. I've asked our panel to think about these contests over authenticity and representation. What do these conflicts and debates over museums, monuments, and maps tell us about the Georgian past? And why is the past so important to the present? Way back in 1983, when I was an undergraduate, or actually I was a graduate at that time, Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger published an influential book called The Invention of Tradition. And in it, they remarked that, quote, history is selected, written, pictured, popularized, and institutionalized by those whose function it is to do so. End of quote. All states attempt to control the history. Georgia is no different. But in looking at maps, museums, and monuments, as we will do today, I think we can get a better sense of how Georgia's historical narratives were created and why. So, welcome, Andrew. Good to see you.
Oh, good to see you too.
Yeah. So that was my little introduction to the panel. And now I think what I will do is I'll introduce the panelists, and then we will go to Elena, and she will start the discussion with her presentation on monuments. But let me just introduce the 3 panelists we have. Elena Kekelia is a PhD candidate at University of Virginia, Department of Sociology. It's her second PhD. Her current dissertation engages with comparative historical sociology, and she's particularly interested in transnational memory and migrant memories. Elena worked on Soviet Georgian sites of memory, including the conflicted memory around Stalin, for her first PhD, which she received in 2019 from Ilia State University. And that title of that dissertation was The 20th Century Monuments and National Narratives in Georgia. So exactly what we are talking about today. In her current dissertation at University of Virginia, she compares the Georgian, Ukrainian, and Azerbaijani exiled communities that fled the Soviet occupation around the 1920s. And her latest article, I believe it's her latest article, is called National Memory in Exile, the Case of the Georgian Emigre Community, 1921 to 2018. It's published in Nations and Nationalism, and I encourage you all to read it. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece. Our second speaker is Andrew Anderson, a great map maker, and I've used his maps constantly in my book, so I'm very grateful to him. He's a political scientist, historian, a historical cartographer with a major research focus on communist and post-communist studies, international interethnic conflicts, and territorial disputes and ideological clashes. He combines his research activities with an extensive experience in counseling and field research in conflict areas. Until 2020, Andrew was a research fellow at the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. That's in Alberta in Canada. And he has over 20 years of teaching experience at several universities in North America and Europe. He is the author and co-author of 7 books, and there's one that I, again, would like particularly to recommend that was recently published in 2018 called Georgia and the International Treaties of 1918 to 1921. That was published by Asteroid Publishing in 2018. Again, you can get that on Amazon, so recommended. And finally, last, as they say, I'm going to use a cliche, last but not least, is David Lord-Kipanidze. He's a member of the Georgian National Academy of Sciences and a foreign member of the USA National Academy of Sciences. He has led the Georgian National Museum since its establishment in 2004, and his scientific interests are related to human evolution and issues of natural history. He is most well known as a paleoanthropologist, and his name is closely associated, of course, with the archaeological site of Dmanisi in eastern Georgia, where a trove of hominid fossils were found dating back 1.8 million years, which sent shock waves through the archaeological community and changed prevailing views about when humans first left Africa and who they were. So this was a very important discovery, and David has led numerous digs and expeditions in Dmanisi. He's the author of over 180 scientific publications, including dozens of articles in journals such as Nature, Science Magazine, and PNAS. He's also a professor at Tbilisi State University, and he's received lots of awards from Georgia, France, Germany, and elsewhere. So I'm not going to, if I was to read everything I could, I would be doing this for half an hour. So I'm going to stop there. I think just let's begin. And Elena, I think, has a PowerPoint, and I'm going to give each of the presenters about 15 minutes. You can put your questions, and I hope you will have some, into the Q&A. We're not going to do it through chat. We're going to do it through Q&A. So please put your questions there. And after 45, 50 minutes or so, we'll come to your questions, and I will feed them to our panelists and see what they have to say. So, Ellen, I'm going to turn it over to you. And thank you very much, all of you, for giving us your time. And Elena, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Stephen, and hello, everyone. I will share my screen. Just a second. All right, I think you can all see your screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. All right, so today I'm going to present on victory or tragedy, monuments, and Georgian national memory. And I will start with the basic statement that we humans know that tragedy is everywhere, tragedy and suffering. There is no escape from tragedy. But tragedy did not have a proper place in public sphere of Soviet Georgia. And most scholars now know that tragic stories of victimhood and suffering were carefully erased from official history. Instead, Georgians were victorious. They were the poster card success story of an ethnic group within the Soviet Union. They were happy. Their culture was thriving, their country was sunny, and their food and dance were popular and loved across the Soviet Union. So where did tragedy go, and how did tragedy try to carve out space or even occupy Georgian public discourse? Today, I will discuss different monuments and one particular site of memory that illustrates this evolving tension between the place of tragedy and victory in the Georgian national memory. Let's start with the Soviet era and the resistance to the concept of tragedy. For this, I will bring examples from Gogi Ochauri's work. In 2015, when I was working on my first dissertation, I was fortunate to interview several prominent Georgian sculptors. One of them was now deceased Ochauri. Quote, "What is interesting about me is that there were no one monument that I installed without causing a big scandal," he told me quite proudly. Quote, I started to gain freedom when I was a student, and they took half of my life from me. 20 years, 15 years, insults. I do not have any monument that they have not destroyed. And indeed, he had several controversial monuments, such as the Uprising, his famous diploma work, the Sea, the Restoration, Vajab World War II Memorial of Glory. His monuments were criticized for several reasons, but two of them certainly tried to displace the theme of Soviet victory and therefore caused censorship. One such monument was the World War II Memorial of Glory. He received the job by chance when his friend Meskhishvili asked for help. The friend presented Ochiauri's work instead of his own. Shahvanadze, the first secretary of the Communist Party, liked it, and that's how he got commissioned to do the work. Problems started to arise when Shahvanadze got involved in the art project revision. Apparently, Shahvanadze did not like the composition's given name, Requiem. Quote, what is this, said Shahvanadze. I want it to be celebratory and not grieving or mourning. In other words, this was a case when the sculptor tried to introduce a tragic narrative into Soviet sculpture. Other World War II memorials did not depict a similar picture. In other memorials, soldiers were certainly other memorials were certainly dedicated to the memory of the dead, but the symbolic soldier was always whole and victorious. Whereas here we see soldiers missing limbs, they are chopped and mutilated. Placing chopped soldiers in a victorious narrative was quite difficult for the existing Communist Party. So there is a rejection of the tragic narrative of the Requiem in favor of the victorious celebration. But for the sculptor, for him, this monument was a symbol of the Georgian soldiers fighting for Georgia for centuries. Eventually, due to constant censorship, it took 12 years to make this monument. Gogi used a well-known trick. He published a different sketch in Drosha newspaper where ordinary whole soldiers were depicted, while he secretly worked on chopped soldiers. Despite Shahvanadze's pressure to change Ochiauri's work, the sculptor refused and created the work he wanted to create. The composition was saved with the help of a friend who made changes that left both parties satisfied and saved the monument from removal. However, the monuments were not left in place in peace for long. The sculptor said that it was later removed and broken by Zviad Gamsahurdia's wife, after which Ochiauri collected this part for reconstruction. Finally, after August War of 2008, these soldiers were transferred to Gori by Saakashvili government. We can see that after the restoration of the Georgian independence, different narratives of this monument, the Soviet one and the sculptor's one, were actualized. While Gamsahurdia's government perceived the monument as Soviet and dismantled it, Saakashvili's government moved the mutilated soldiers to Gori after the Russia-Georgian War. In the case of Gamsahurdia, the monument had Soviet significance, and in the case of Saakashvili, the narrative of the Requiem was activated. Another monument, a female torso torn into parts named Restoration, represented a similar tension. The sculptor recalled that this monument was stolen and destroyed after he gave a political speech during Gamsahurdia presidency. He blamed Patiashvili, the first secretary of the Georgian Communist Party, for this. Later, Patiashvili apologized, but Ochiauri recalls that the monument was only placed back after Gamsahurdia was removed from power. Quote, this is how he was lying to me. They called the monument Chopped Georgia. I was telling them it's not chopped, but I could not help it. Now I want to bring your attention to another Georgian site of memory located in France, the Château de Leuville. In 1921, the Soviet occupation of Georgia led to a political exile where the émigré community engaged in an active meaning-making process. Initially, this chateau was bought in 1922 by the Georgian exiles with state funds. But once the Soviet Union was internationally recognized, they legalized it as a private property in order to safeguard it from the Soviet claims on ownership. During the Soviet occupation, the castle acted as a center of the exiled community, but the will of the exiles stated that when Georgia will regain independence, the chateau will be transferred to it. While the exiles were trying to establish the tragic narrative of occupation, in Soviet Georgia, February 1921 was represented as the liberation of Georgia, and the memory of the Democratic Republic of Georgia was washed away. Of the three most important historical dates of the Georgian nation, Independence Day was the most celebrated and mentioned in the emigre newspapers. The occupation of Georgia, 1921, and the rebellion of 1924 were certainly discussed, but in tragic terms, whereas the Independence Day was a success story and a victorious narrative and appeared in emigre newspapers 3 times more than 1921 and twice as often than 1924. The exiles refused to be the losers, and they presented themselves as victorious while portraying the Bolsheviks as losers. They would claim that, quote, the nation has lost the war physically, but won it morally. While measuring the tone of emigre articles, an unexpected entanglement emerged between the narrative of victory and tragic discourse. The dominant tone was hopeful and combative. It claimed without any shred of doubt that the end of Soviet rule was near and imminent. The tragic narratives of suffering, misery, and injustice were used to enhance those of hope and resistance. Victimhood was presented as success because it revealed the martyrdom of the Georgian nation. Eventually, this chateau came to symbolize the success story of the First Democratic Republic of Georgia. In 2018, the centennial celebration of independence marked the first time the Georgian government had officially hosted a commemorative event at this site of memory. Official speeches emphasized the symbolic importance of this castle, the necessity of honoring the past, and valuable contribution of the exiles. In addition, during a gala concert at the UNESCO venue, official statements were made that inscribed Georgia in the European family already a century ago. Quote, contrary to what is sometimes believed, Georgia was not born independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it has been a democratic and progressive European republic 100 years ago, claimed the ambassador of Georgia. In 2018, Georgia effectively claimed the national memory of a century-old democracy, independence, and Soviet victimhood. In the end, the descendants of the political exiles exchanged property rights to the castle for a commitment to the DRG, the First Democratic Republic of Georgia, and the political exiles. Most of the descendants' conditions were about the restoration of the political immigration's rightful place in modern Georgian history and the obligations to study and commemorate the First Republic. In return, the descendants gave Georgian government officials the right to own and use once suppressed and stored emigre memory, which is a memory of Soviet occupation, a memory of European values, independence, and success. Interestingly, this tension between tragic and victorious narratives were even revealed after all these years during these celebratory events. This time, the struggle was between two emigre camps. On the one hand, one camp, represented by Otar Zurabishvili, wanted to install a monument of political immigration in Tbilisi, which would be related to the tragic occupation. On the other hand, the other camp, the Social Democrats, wanted to safeguard the celebratory spirit of the Independence Day and fought hard against Otar's initiative. As Gocha Javahishvili mentioned, the protest was about the primacy of the tragic monument in a particular period, while no monument was planned about Noe Jordania. Quote, they protested that this was an attempt from Otar to divert attention when there is this centenary of independence. Why are you erecting a monument which is related to the knocking down of the independence? We know that the political immigration started in 1921. So why do you want to bring a mourning vibe in a celebratory spirit so that you can already create an apocalypse in the Genesis? It is hard to not agree with them on that matter, said Gocha. Today, the rehabilitation of the chateau is still going on. Despite its financial reservations, the Georgian government attributed 5.5 million and took all responsibility for the transformation of the chateau. This responsibility was recently called into question in the Georgian social media when a citizen shared pictures of the chateau's attic, which portrayed the chateau in severely neglected condition. Government officials were quick to reply and refute this picture. To conclude, I want to present a figure from my recently published article and illustrate how the emigre memory was transferred to modern Georgian national memory. My study shows that exiles used four constructs: occupation, a civilization, victory, and differentiation to create this memory. First, the exiles promoted the idea that Georgia was an independent country that was occupied. So the first narrative framework is a tragic one, and this was a counter-narrative to the one that was produced in Soviet Georgia, where the First Republic and the occupation was totally washed away from Soviet historiography. In the emigre journals, the occupation was constantly described as forceful, aggressive, inhuman condition, murdering, being enchained, and other. Then apocalyptic accounts were told on how life got expensive, people hungry, country bankrupted, how agriculture failed, industry vanished, and diseases like cholera and typhus spread. For instance, when talking about the famine, the authors claim that Georgians are labeled as second-rate citizens, forced to feed and provide for the Red Army occupying Georgia, as well as the starving Russian population in their own homeland. Quote, Bolsheviks are directly mocking the misery of the Georgian nation at its greatest tragedy. In a starving and ravaged Georgia, they formed committees whose function is to widely collect donations for Russian people. These four narratives are intertwined rather than limited to binary categories of tragic or glorious. Their predominantly victorious tone was rooted in a tragic past and national martyrdom. I found the exilic identity best understood through the lens of trauma. They were the ones who discussed the traumatized physical body of Soviet Georgians. The Soviet Georgians occupied a successful niche in the Soviet Union that was not based in tragedy. Meanwhile, emigre Georgians voiced a narrative of victory rooted in tragedy and occupation. Eventually, the exilic national memory that carried components of victimhood and tragedy overtook the existing national identity of Soviet Georgians. In the 1990s, Georgian society was already ready to receive this tragic narrative safeguarded in the emigre memory. The traumatic past was now an available past, and the cadaver of the Democratic Republic of Georgia revealed itself to the once successful and happy Georgians. After the Soviet archives were opened, the academic community discovered the history of the DRG. They reinterpreted the Soviet past through a new lens of tragedy in place of the Soviet narrative of success. The narrative of successful Georgians vanished, and this time the emigre memory of tragedy was fully embraced. For those who follow Georgian politics, would notice that even a pro-Russian government such as the Georgian Dream is having a hard time to dismantle the discourse of tragedy, victimhood, and European integration. In the first years of power, they have been careful to not contradict this narrative, but lately they have opposed it publicly. But so far, several mass protests in support of Ukraine and Euro integration demonstrate the prevalence of such national memory in Georgia. You can find my article, as Stephen has mentioned, in the following link for those interested in reading more about the Georgian exiles. And thank you. I'm happy to answer your questions and comments.
Elena, thank you very much, and thank you for keeping in on time as well. We'll wait for until everybody's finished and to take the questions, but thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew now. Andrew, I don't know whether you have a PowerPoint to show us, but it doesn't matter if you don't. But
unfortunately, I don't, but I will show you. I printed out a couple of things just to show you. Maybe it will work.
Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to you. About 15-20 minutes, if you could keep it into that.
Sure, I will try. Dear colleagues, I'm delighted to see you all today. I just have to mention one thing. My last name is not Anderson, as it is under my picture. I'm Andersen. Mm-hmm. Well, some people have trouble with that, but that's okay. Maybe it can be fixed somehow. Anyway, today I would like to say a few words about teaching history with historical maps. Several years ago, at a conference organized by the US Foreign Policy Research Institute, Professor Dov Zakheim mentioned that the current generation, unlike its predecessors, doesn't seem to have a sense of history, while that quality is critical. He also said that it's a great skill and even art to appropriately apply the lessons of the past to strategy and policy, both current and future ones. However, the skill and art should start with a more or less clear understanding that those lessons are really lessons. Unfortunately, the skill and art mentioned above have been largely lost, I believe, and as a result, contemporary people do not wish to learn any lessons from the past. Others who still do learn those lessons are a tiny minority and have to watch helplessly those who do not. However, there is an alternative to helplessly watching. The alternative is to continue doing historical research on the under-researched past and to share it by publishing related articles and books, as well as by teaching history in the classroom. Like a few other colleagues of ours, we prefer that alternative. Now, what's the best way to teach history in our modern age? This is a pertinent question. A century ago, and even some 25 years ago, history books and lectures were usually presented to students as lengthy and arid texts with few, if any, illustrations or maps. While some educators did provide students with high-quality historical maps, this was rather the exception than the rule. Today, can we expect to engage our students with obscure texts filled with unfamiliar or semi-unfamiliar names and events? I guess you would agree that it is doubtful. Well, I would like to, actually, why so? Well, let's remember the immortal book by Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and give the floor to the little girl Alice, who said, "What is the use of a book without pictures or maps?" Why did I quote Alice? It's because it's no secret that students are becoming increasingly infantilized before our very eyes. Let's not delve into the socio-psychological reasons for this phenomenon right now, and let's just agree that this is probably a reality. I don't want to judge this phenomenon right now and say that it's bad. It might be not even bad, but the fact remains it's impossible to hold the attention of listeners or readers with dry texts alone these days. If multimedia isn't offered to them, students may fall asleep right in the classroom or simply close the book and never open it again. On the other hand, it could be difficult for students to remember certain historical facts and events without the aid of a map. For example, when hearing or reading about the Peace of Versailles, which awarded Belgium the territories of Eupen and Normandy, it can be challenging to visualize their locations without a map. Who knows where Eupen and Normandy are? Similarly, when discussing the disputed territory between Armenia and Georgia in 1918-1920, which included the counties of Halkalaki and Borchalov, it may be hard to understand the context without a map. And even when describing the struggle for Abkhazia during the same period, even Georgian students who are familiar, for example, with the location of the Pso River, may have hard time to imagine the locations of Mehadir and Makopse. Those are just the examples. Fortunately, today we have access to a wide range of technical tools, including graphic elements that enable us to provide history students with illustrations and historical maps, some of which are even interactive these days. This can greatly enhance the learning experience. However, it should be acknowledged that while there are hardly any problems with illustrations today, the situation with historical maps is much, much worse. Why so? Because there simply aren't enough of them. What is the reason for such a situation? To address this question, we should first understand who is qualified to create historical maps and what skills those people require. The answer is straightforward. Such a person should be an educated historian and at the same time should possess advanced graphic skills, effectively making him sort of a graphic artist. Well, during the Renaissance era and a bit beyond, individuals with such combined skills were more readily found. However, in our present society, marked by narrow specialization, finding professionals with both historical and graphic expertise could be a significant challenge. First of all, creating a high-quality historical maps requires a significant amount of time. Incompetent people may say, what difficulties are there with those maps? You just Google something and the Google will give you any map you need. Just ask Google. Yes, of course, Google will give you almost any contemporary map with unchanged physical features, of course. The outlines of the coastline and mountain ranges, rivers, lakes, and that's about it. Even after obtaining this data from Google, the creator of a historical map still has to manually transfer them to a graphic file, spending a long time without taking his hand off the computer mouse. Of course, once such work is done, the obtained contour maps of a certain region can be used to create many new historical maps. That's what we're doing. Adding to them military actions, changing borders, occupied or transferred territories, and so on and so forth. But even at this preliminary stage, the time-consuming preparatory work doesn't end. Putting aside the fact that even over several decades, the outlines of lakes can change. Let's remember at least two natural disasters of the 20th century. I mean, the drying up of the Aral Sea and the drying up of Lake Sivan in Armenia. And the location of cities and towns also can slightly shift. But we should not forget about another problem. Changes in city names and river names, for example. In a number of Eastern European countries, for example, the names of cities and rivers have changed at least twice over the last 100 years. While in the Caucasus, including Georgia, and in adjacent lands, in adjacent areas of Turkey and Iran, they have changed it 3 times or sometimes even more for the same period. And all this requires separate research using a large amount of professional literature and different languages. And even that is not all. After the preparatory work, the most interesting and enjoyable part, of course, in my opinion, is adding historical events of the past to the already prepared contour maps. But these actions, again, cannot be done without serious preliminary research. In other words, the time-consuming process of creating each worthy historical map requires significant amount of time. And here arises a new question. Who and from what means can pay for the work of such specialists? Unfortunately, today, this is also a big problem. This could be one of the reasons why we don't have enough historical maps today, and why many of the ones we do have are of really poor quality. Often map creators are not given enough time to produce accurate and high quality maps. But that's only one problem. Here is an example of what can happen when a map is created by a good cartographer who is not well versed in history. Recently, a colleague of mine came across a historical atlas that had been published, had just been printed in Germany by Putzgers, an established publisher. It was printed on high quality paper and in high definition. However, when he looked at the page dedicated to the Soviet-Georgian War of 1921, he was surprised, if not shocked, because he saw that the Red Army, according to the author of that map, was shown invading Georgia through Batumi. According to the map's author, the 11th Army had landed in Batumi and then marched onto Tbilisi. What an accurate representation of the actual events. This is only one example. It's a shame that my colleague hadn't taken a picture of that beautiful map, but whatever done is done. Now I would like to address a problem with historical maps that have been published worldwide in the past 100 years, which is directly connected with the understudied history of Georgia. From the late 19th century and up until 1995, maybe 93, most historical atlases published in Mother Europe and in North America largely ignored the existence of Georgia as a state in the past. So in fact, they were rewriting history. This was likely due to a widespread opinion among colleagues in history that Georgia and the Caucasus in general were nothing more but Russia's backyard and would remain so, more or less forever. Therefore, why bother studying its history? As a result, many historical maps covering the East Mediterranean, such as those devoted to the Crusades or, for example, periods embracing the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, or even maps devoted to the Great Schism, do not show Georgia as a country. Instead, its territory is shown as part of the Arab Muslim world or as part of other empires, despite the fact that during the periods described, Georgia existed as an independent kingdom or as a group of kingdoms and princely states. In view of the above, it's not surprising that at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, when the Georgian delegation showed up, many Western diplomats and even political leaders were surprised at asking naive questions like, what is Georgia? Has it ever been separate from Russia? And even as recently as in 1990, a few members of the British Parliament made public statements, public speeches in which they mentioned that the West was not going to recognize the independence of any of the Soviet republics except the Baltic states, because, I'm quoting, unlike the Baltic states, they had never been independent nations and were never conquered by Russia or the USSR. That's a direct result of limited historical knowledge due to, among other things, due to those historical atlases. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time today to discuss the politicization of historical mapping in details. Here I mean a number of maps and atlases documenting the history of the Caucasus that have been recently published in Russia and or funded by Russia, even if published in the West. Some of these maps include, for example, a united Georgia during the reign of Queen Tamar the Great, but believe it or not, without Abkhazia, or sometimes even without parts of the so-called South Ossetia. And this is just one example of politicized mapping, but it highlights the concerning situation in this field. And finally, I would like to mention that while there is currently a shortage of objective historical maps of Georgia published worldwide, this vacuum is being filled with disinformation. While there have been some quality maps published, but unfortunately not enough. And as the old proverb says, the sacred place is never empty. Consequently, the internet is awash with pseudo-historical maps that are marked by wishful thinking. Among them are the so-called historical maps of the first Georgian republics with international recognized borders. Let me show you, if you can see one of those examples. Here it is. Can you see it?
Not really, no. You have to pull back a bit, Andrew.
Okay, like this?
And then raise it a bit.
Yes?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. These Georgian maps are based on a map drawing for the Georgian delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, which aimed to show territorial claims, but not real borders. And unfortunately, similar pseudo-historical maps of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine for the same period are also circulating on the internet and are sometimes included in, for example, Wikipedia articles and beyond. As I mentioned earlier, a sacred place is never empty. Here is another map of the so-called historical map of the First Republic of Azerbaijan. You see, it includes even Batumi. And this is from Wikipedia.
Okay.
Or, of course, this map of the First Republic of Armenia. Here it is. You probably saw such examples of historical cartography. And the best, the symphony is this map of Ukraine, where the southernmost Ukrainian city is Gagor. Well, nothing to do with the real, show it upside down? No, nothing to do with reality, but it's circulating, and some students of history even believe that this is a real map of Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, you name it. In conclusion, I would like to take the liberty to say that we have a wide field of activity in this sphere, and we will keep working in this direction. I believe that's all we can do at this moment. So that's it.
Thank you, Andrew. Very interesting sort of broad survey. I'm hoping in Q&A there will be some questions that will talk about the way that maps are manipulated in Georgia, so we can focus on Georgia in particular. That will be very useful. So I'm sort of appealing to, I guess, our audience to think about how this relates to Georgia. David, I'm going to pass it on to you. We can't hear you. David, we cannot hear you.
But now you can hear me.
Now
right?
we can hear you, yes. Good.
Well, thank you. I will continue. I think to be last, it's not always least, as you said, because some people said already you can continue, and I'm very happy to listen to this to different way of looking of Georgian history. You know, as you mentioned, my research is much far away to the modern history, and I think it's crucial to find a ways how you can connect it, right? Since I'm in field or student, I always heard the words past, present, future should be connected. We need interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research. That's very true, but how to do it, right? And I think the same challenge is how to tell history, and what be like episodes. You mentioned this very important, of course, episode, but very small ones like Leville or the story of maps in one case, or look on the bigger story, right? Where is it? You see, I have one book of my very good colleague, Short History of the Life on the Earth, which is 4.6 billion years old, which written in 200 pages, right? This is a point, you see, how we should tell Georgian history. I'm more for, may say my profession makes us to write more big history, right? Long history, but how this big history you can tell short, and how we can have the both trustworthy history and the storytelling. Right storytelling to be approached. And I think for Georgia, this is a challenge. It's not just for Georgia. I think it's a challenge today, how you can combine both, where you can trust, but also you can enjoy, and you can like how the way it was told. And for me, museum today, it's this combination of different facets. And today, I think Georgia is one of the countries who tries to tell it. But to start on history, just to history of 21st century, I think for my profession, maybe it's very short term, right? But how you are developing, let's say, strategy of storytelling through museums, and how it should be a real way, part of your identity, which is, may I say, even Georgians have very long story of identity, is an evolutionary process. And when we are talking about history of Georgia, of course, first you are looking on geography, which has, I was often told that, oh, you have very complicated geography. No, I think we have wonderful geography. The question is how you are using it. You are on the real crossroad, not by just words, of big systems. This is today, maybe it's a political and geopolitical system, but before it was, let's say, biogeographical system. So I will use the word biocultural. So where I can't see the differences, we couldn't split today nature and culture as a history. And one important point is that Georgia is one of rare biodiversity hotspots. What it means, you have very special nature, but what is your advantage and difference? Despite of other 35 biodiversity hotspots, you have rich nature, but you can tell story, you can study evolution. it means that you could be interesting for big question history of nature, and simultaneously it's reflected this big diversity and long history in archaeological records. I just showed small map. So what is our advantage, may I say, in very small territory, you can have a big biodiversity and cultural continuity. And our work is to tell this story to two directions, one through national narrative and one to correlate it to big questions of humanity. And I think one of the good examples is story of first humans out of Africa, which is, you already mentioned, Dmanisi. I will not talk today on the anatomic features of Dmanisi hominids. It's not so interesting in this case, but let's look from another angle, how this story puts you on map and how you to be integrated in big, let's say, in big network. And I will go to this second point, that you can only get it through be part of network, right? So this is a big scientific question issue, which is worldwide recognized, and we have several papers, Nature Science, covers of National Geographic, and also the one brand which can be used as attraction, First Europeans, which is indirectly connected. But you see, sometimes these marketing tools can be used because it makes you pride. When we are talking today about why we should be with Europe, all Georgians like to be first European. See, this is maybe small detail, but it works, believe me. See. And same you are in 100 best discovery in the world, where you can use one hand to be with big scientific discoveries, but also big archaeological record like Tutankhamun or Pompeii and so on, but use for later also your history. This site of Dmanisi is a big biological or human evolution discovery, but it's on the medieval side. So this is an opportunity for us to show this medieval story together with our early history. And I don't think that it will attract so big attention, the medieval history of Georgia, to visit and to see, but you know, in this combination, it's a very strong synergy. So, and this is a point. And third point of storytelling is interaction. You know, in the local level and in next 21st century, I don't think just pontificating of storytelling works. It's important to develop new type of museums where you have, for example, even archaeology live, and to have this combination where you have a heritage, but storytelling with a high, may I say, professional basis, I mean architectural standards and all the aesthetic, but also, may I say, interaction. And another big story we will use, and we are very lucky, story of wine. You see, the question of discovery of first wine is not big story for, let's say, for paleobiology or biomolecular story. It's one hand, you see very early residues, but for cultural development is very crucial. And this is a way where Georgia is part of big cases of first farming, first agriculture, and story of big scientific issues of the development of first civilization in Near East, may I say, the Fertile Crescent, how you are part of it. But to get this, it was necessary still very high scientific standard, like for the Dmanisi case. So after only publishing the paper in American National Academy, Georgia became cradle of wine. But now how you are telling this story, and our advantage in this case was this, that we were able to show uninterrupted cultural story of wine. So let's say you are starting from 8,000, but you are coming today, and you are combining in this case still natural sciences and humanities. And of course, only if it's a very high level of scientific level. And one of our exhibition in France, in Bordeaux, it was starting from 8,000, but to go to the modern history of Georgia through wine, which is a direction. And then, of course, if you want to this kind of storytelling to be as a system, you need institutions, right? And today's, this is a museum's mission: research, preserve, present, educate, entertainment. It's must. But how to make not just copy paste, but how to use in your own case. And I think one of its only way is to find a way to synergize culture, science, and exploration, right? And in our case, I'm more for, not I'm, our team is to create big network around country, because you can't change mind, you can't influence to have just this only capital cases, which we had. Everything happened in Tbilisi. You have big, wonderful, maybe buildings and maybe educational places, but to be in strong development and on the local level particularly, you need big web, big network of local development. So for us, it's the priority to storytelling in regions like this is Bolnisi Museum, which Bolnisi not many people know, but it's a wonderful place where you can tell big story through archaeology, through geology, archaeology, but go to the ethnography. This is one of the most here is, you see, Neolithic, Bronze Age, but this is a place where we have one of the most multicultural place, Armenian, Azerbaijan, Greek, and here we have a special programs in Armenian, in German, of course in German also, because this was German settlers, but also in Azerbaijan, Armenian languages. What I want to say, the way to trustworthy communication is what can be used for history storytelling, and use these historical facts, not just one way, but to integrate. Another big story we try to use is the story of Golden Fleece. Everyone knows this story, right? And you can use this internationally big story that this is the most famous Greek myth, and we can see in Caucasus, in Georgia, in Colchis, really proof of it, indirect. But the question is, what is this narrative which can be used for the next stage? First, of course, to create very high-level museums. And this is one museum which I hope this year will be is already nominated Best Museums of Europe. But the question is, what you are telling here, story. This is storytelling of time period of Greek colonization, where you have your identity. You have your identity, which is in the time period where it's big cultural expansion. You are keeping it, and you are interconnected with that. This is a message which you need permanently to repeat with in Georgian society, that you were never island, but you were never also fully part of somebody. You see, this is exactly this balance where using scientific story, you are spreading this message and also showing that the main identity, Christianity, is not came from somewhere. It's continuity of your classical history. This is, and you can see it. And another this type of storytelling we have in Mestia, in Svaneti, in high mountains, where you are creating another narrative, which is not a bubble, still on scientific level, like you have refugee of the Byzantine period, but you were keeping identity, you are continuing your own history, but as I told you, with interaction. So I think this is a basis where including when you asked me, we were talking how Georgia's museum should be. It's not just Georgian museums. Today we call museums, but it's a multifaceted institution. But number one, their purpose is interaction and storytelling and public outreach with, may I say, younger generation, right? Of course, we need tourism, we need these high-end things, but this is number one. And in this case, we are, I think, able to do it. And to continue this story about museums and heritage, you know, it's always very special in Georgia interaction with church, right? You see, and I think one of the biggest balance can be found through it, may I say, synergy and working and presentation your Christian history. To be not just slave fundamentalists or slavery in towards on fully, let's say, I don't want to say ultra liberalism way. Georgia needs this balance, and museums are places where you can be, and it should come always state of storytelling of these directions. And this is one of the books which was recently published, and we did with a private foundation exactly about Georgian treasury and how, and this book everyone can download from internet. This is a point. One hand, how you are getting toward values through your museum stories. And this is crucial, may I say. Of course, it's important, cultural heritage, economy, and so on. Make inspirations that we have early wine, that's why we can wine cultivation on Mars, using all new technologies, applications. But you know, to go to this storytelling, you need trust fall. I didn't mention, I don't know if we still have time, a few words on Soviet occupation period, right? But this is continuity of it. How today we are under some challenges in both directions, maybe. I'm sure it's a temporary, you know, I'm very optimistic in this way. But how to use these platforms, how to use different platforms where you have a combination of classical object-based storytelling with new technology, and how it can be used for the modern issues, right? For the modern issues, you know, and that's why I think the using research, and even in 20th century history, which is even it's your the main subject, and I was very impressed when you presented first time this approach of how you can study 20th century history or modern history. But what we need, from my point of view, to prepare more and more population that what you are telling, it has a trust, right? And how we can transform and influence on the modern society, not with, may I say, fundamental extremes, but a way of thinking and opening it. And I think when what is today's challenges everywhere. We have a war next to us. Suddenly, nature made this big earthquake in Turkey, but how we are prepared, what are the antidotes for it? And I think this, let's call them still museums, but it's different institutions, particularly in regions, may I say, where is for it. This was what I wanted to say, that, and it's not but, you see, art, science, and culture, it's not just slogans, you see, what I want.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, David. I think you raised some very important questions, and, you know, particularly the issue about what museums function in the world is today, or what their function is in different countries. And, you know, clearly that's a big debate going on and around the world, and museums are rapidly changing in terms of what they are doing and how they're presenting their materials. And you're right, you know, in some sense, going beyond this idea that a museum is simply a depository for, ancient artifacts, right? It has to go beyond that. But here's a question for you. So, and I will come to the other questions that our viewers are putting up, but let me just open this up as a beginning. You talk about storytelling, right? I guess the question is, what story are you trying to tell? And your audience in many cases are school children or students, right? For example, if we want to go beyond museums and their traditional function, right? Do we also want to go beyond the traditional storytelling that is within a national framework, right? So right now, the museum, for example, is called the Georgian National Museum. I can remember when it used to be called the Georgian State Museum. So now that I think there is a much more emphasis on the national sort of framework of storytelling. How do you, I mean, to come, particularly, I guess this might be a question for you as a paleontologist, when there was no real national framework to talk of, how do you balance this storytelling within the confines of a nation with something like the rediscovery, which obviously goes out of those bounds? It's not connected to those bounds.
You see, let's start this way. The National Museum, it's not just museum, and it's a project also. It's a more Smithsonian type institution where you can have museums and research centers together. Let me remind you a little bit that in 90s, where we got independence and we started off, we had many different changes, particularly immediately in politics, economic way, but not much in science, education, and culture, right? It started mostly from 2004, real changes.
Right.
So, and this was one of the experiments which we decided after collapse of Academy of Science, after collapse of Soviet Union, was the Academy of Science, which was main scientific institution in whole Georgia, and not in just Georgia. This was, I can use was broken down, right? And what could be alternatives? So the idea was that let's use heritage-based sciences to have under one umbrella and network. So the idea was, and still is, of course, to have three different types of storytelling. One is in city, in Tbilisi, where you have a National Museum of Art, National Museum of History, National Open Area Museum, Natural History Museum. Second is when you are telling story of regions, and you have a, let's say, biocultural history of region like Svaneti, we did one in Akhaltsikhe, one in Bolnisi, and third is sites where you are telling on this special place, storytelling of something which is important on the same, let's say in our case, archaeological site, but it doesn't matter. Tomorrow it can be natural history, it could be one church. And our point, at which I strongly believe in it, it should be, one hand it has hierarchy, but from other hand, it's a big system, interconnection. So, and that's why the point is, in one case, you are telling in a central system, you are telling with abstracts, everything. Then you have a local stories, and then you have one specific story. This is how I can see interaction. It's a little bit complicated system, particularly for the one ministry, and maybe challenges which we have now is with this, because it's very difficult to control through one ministry because you have different facets. But as I say, and I will tell to audience, it's ongoing project. It's not final system, you see. It's our approach, how we are trying to build in Georgia, not copy paste from other countries.
Right.
And that's a point. Yes.
Yeah. And I must say, looking at that at the museum in Vani and Bolnisi, that really you are moving forward very quickly and creating spectacular museums. So I want to congratulate you on that. Let me go to Elena. We have a question for Elena. This comes from Becca Kobachidze, and Elena, he's asking you, do we have any evidence that the current government in Georgia has any policy for framing collective memory? If they do, what is it and how is it demonstrated? So it's a question related to what I asked David. What's the story that Georgia wants to tell through its narrative, through its monuments, for example? Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Excellent question. And hello, Becca. So I would start to answer this question by saying that what are the things that you can do to show your interest into preserving or fostering some kind of collective memory? So let's say there is a particular monument or a site of memory. What can you do? You can either preserve it and commemorate it as it is. You can either transform it. Let's say we had a Vajapshavela memorial on Tatsmita Pantheon and somebody put a cross in it. They were, somebody was trying to transform it as a religious memorial, but then later it was removed. Let's say you can do something like that. You can try to change the story of the monument, or you can destroy it. You can remove it, right? So there are various ways that you can show your indication what you want to do about this particular memory. And based on some of the evidence that I've collected, we can say that let's start with the Chateau de Leuville itself, which is this symbolic site that I've chosen to present about. I would say that the interest in the Chateau de Leuville was apparent even during Shevardnadze's time. But then it was only after 2004 that really movement started, the government started to make some kind of deal with the exiles. And at first it stalled for various reasons. I won't go into the details, but in 2011, there were first memorandum from the Georgian government and the exiles that were a first step into this kind of devolution. And then in 2016 and in 2018, there was practically a memorandum and devolution documents that I've studied, which indicate a responsibility of the Georgian government to preserve and foster the memory of the first democratic republic, or even to change how the Georgian society, perceive Georgian exiles, because frankly, in Soviet times, they were not really perceived well. There were a lot of narratives about them fleeing and them abandoning the country, kind of negative narratives about them. So the exiles were trying to negotiate and ask from the government to basically honor the exiles and appreciate the work that they've done. And they were very successful in this negotiation because they managed to transfer the rights of the castle with conditions that acknowledged most of I think all of the conditions that they set forward. So the Georgian government agreed to this and took responsibility. It's another story how he will, fulfill this responsibility, and we will have to see, because it's going to take 10 years and 6 has passed, I think. But that is basically an evidence that the government is interested into preserving this site of memory, or reincorporating this site of memory as part of the Georgian history. And this was evident in 2018 when they were making these speeches, and they were publicly acknowledging the role of the exiles, the role of this political immigration, the role of the first democratic republic, because this was also kind of advantageous for the country, because you could claim that you were a country 100 years ago. You could claim that you were part of Europe. You could claim that you were a success story, and you could also claim the victimhood memory. So that's let's say, one evidence of how we can say that the government has some kind of policy or is interested into doing that. We can also talk about other evidences, but from 2004, for example, our colleagues have published about memory politics from 2004 and how there were different memory projects, like the installation of the Occupation Museum that David knows a lot probably about. Even, for example, the installation of a symbolic monument at Tatsminta Pantheon of repressed Georgians under the Soviet Union. So Georgians who were repressed in 1937. Now there is a symbolic memorial that was installed at the Tatsminta Pantheon, and so was Kakuta Cholokashvili brought back in Georgia with very glorious and big celebration. I remember it. I remember it was even streamed on the TV. So you have these kind of symbolic gestures that kind of indicate if the government is basically engaging with some kind of memory politics, right? And we could see a number of this engagement during Saakashvili government with the Occupation Museum, even with Stalin Gori Museum. You could see that they couldn't change it, but they kind of tried to carve out a little room in the basement where you have the Russo-Georgian war room now that, all this war. So basically the room is dedicated to the war of 2008. But on the other hand, I would also answer to Becca by saying that while the government, let's say, took responsibility on Lvivl and tried to incorporate it in its own national narrative, on the other hand, I would say that during the same years, they also supported the reinstitution of Stalin monuments in some cities. For example, when I studied the destroyed monuments, the Stalin monuments that were painted in pink or destroyed and then basically put back by the communities in the villages, I saw official documents that indicated that the government basically gave them the permission to bring back a Stalin monument. One such case was in Tel Aviv when one of the Stalinists showed me an official government document that was allowing him to put back a monument, and so was in Gori. There was a case in Gori too, when in the municipality of Gori they basically funded this kind of activities. So you could see that some government officials were officially supporting Stalin monuments, but when the controversy came out, they pointed their fingers to the local communities and the people living in these communities, because it's a very tricky situation, when you're when you have, let's say, Polish guests or political leaders visiting, and they want an answer of why you still have some Stalin monuments standing around, and you can blame everything on the people. So you could see this kind of basically mixed messages in memory politics from the current Georgian government, that let's say supporting Stalin monuments on one hand, but also kind of bringing back Lvivl. But Lvivl was not a case that started with the current government. I would also say this to Becca, because there was it took a few years. The process had started in 2004, then 2011 got some kind of agreement, and then little by little it kind of reached.
Right.
But it was a process, I would say.
Actually, I was personally involved in trying to retrieve and restore some of those archives in Lvivl. That picture of the attic is accurate, at least from 10, 15 years ago, that the materials were not well taken care of, but some restoration has taken place. There is now a library where you can access Noor Jordania's library, for example. So things have improved, and I could see that David would have a role to play, for example, in this discussion about what the museum that they're proposing in Louisville should look like and what it should be doing. Because if as David is saying, it's partly marketing, right? It's storytelling and marketing as well. So you need to have something that's going to attract people to Louisville. You don't simply want a museum that has the clothes and the garments of historical figures. You really need to excite people, and this is something that that hopefully would happen in Louisville. So let me just ask Andrew a question. And I'd like you, Andrew, if you could focus on the case of Georgia. And here's a question that has been posted. It says, what can you tell us about the role of maps in shaping collective memory of Georgians and her neighbors? Maps clearly have been shown to be extremely important in the question of territories in the South Caucasus and have raised many, many disputes, as some maps claim, obviously, territories against other states. I mean, how have maps been utilized or let's say manipulated in those disputes between the three South Caucasian republics?
Well, it's a very good question. The thing is that in some countries of the Caucasus, which luckily do not include, this list wouldn't include Georgia, contemporary historians or pseudo-historians are creating maps that in fact exclude the existence of their neighbors at all. Like the map, for example, of the First Republic of Azerbaijan, which I've shown. Unfortunately, I didn't know that I could share the screen, but at least I showed the picture. And this creates the misconception of history, of national history, that leads to territorial claims and disrespect to the neighbors. By the way, one more interesting thing. Some people hate historical maps because they think that they give some background to the revision of borders and territorial claims. Indeed, if you look at the map of Georgia under Queen Tamar the Great, or even David Aghlenshanibeli, of course, it includes some lands that are not parts of Georgia anymore. The same refers to the First Republic. And I believe it's important to know, for the people to know, that the shape of their country was at some point different. There is nothing bad about it. And then there was decline, then certain territories were lost, and this shouldn't be any background for territorial disputes. But the memory is the memory. People should know their history. And there is nothing bad about knowing that once your country was much bigger and stronger and was to some extent a regional superpower. The same refers to Armenia as well. At some point, it was a superpower, at least in East Mediterranean. So from that point of view, the maps are critically important because up until recently, you could read books about the history of Georgia, but there were no or very little maps, or they were inaccurate. Right now, this makes it way more interesting. Plus, the maps are picturesque and they could be even entertaining. And why not adding entertainment to the learning process? I think it's a good thing.
Right. Okay, so this actually brings us to another question. Irina Demetradze-Rents is asking about how we can build trustworthy narratives and how we can create a context where we can differentiate between false history and good history. I mean, how David, maybe you could address this question.
You see, I would love to speak on it. Very often I had these questions, you see, how to go this way. And I think another aspect of museums is that museum is a scientific infrastructure, right? And museums, particularly our museum, which is Museum of the Caucasus, has a collections from different parts of world, different parts of the Caucasus. It means you are controlling it. Before, mostly in Soviet time, it was hidden, right? It was not open. And here is the balance, about whom belong these objects for storytelling. And recently I was on one meeting in UNESCO, and this was similar questions, you know. And what I answered, and which we want to transmit, that only open for scientific research will be antidote, right? If you will be able to transform the way that, in this case, Azeri-Armenian dispute, but you are open for both, you see, now for Karabakh history, you see, most of collections are in national museums, and we are ready. We are ready for it to be opened. And I think this is only way that creating research projects with joint presentation it's not easy, but it's, excuse me, but PhD is that way. And now one small point I would mention for answer from previous question, you know, I think it's very important, of course, Leville, the place as identity, but I think for Soviet history of Georgian Soviet narrative, Stalin Museum is number one. And this is still an open question, you know, right? This is because it meets together marketing, politics, and transport, right? All together. And since, I don't know, many years since I'm working in museums, there were different proposals. One was to be part of National Museum. I'm strongly against it. It should not be National Museum, but it can be research center. Can you imagine how strong will be? And this idea was every government had this, let's say, discuss these ideas. You see, and I think this is the only way, maybe others can bring, but without joint research, all these issues will be coming back on the other side. So let's use, in this case, collections as science infrastructure. This is my point. Open archives, open work, and demand it. And how to do it, that's a challenge.
Right.
Same with Soviet occupation, you know, I just finished. This was, at that time, it was black and white. We needed just to say that was before told that Soviet Union is pink, we need to show just black. But, you know, I don't think it's only remedy, you know, you need to find some way of more discussion.
Right.
Our Soviet, you see, we need today, because today it's on the, unfortunately, sometimes on the black and white place.
So let me ask you this, David. Actually, let me go to Elena first, and maybe Andrew, and then come back to you. So one of the questions here is from Hayek Demoyan, and he's asking, okay, so yes, the black and white nature of history and how it's interpreted is always a problem. It was particularly a problem, of course, in the Soviet period. But now we're left with a history that was there for 70 years. We're left with Soviet monuments, right? And the question is, you know, what should we do with those Soviet monuments in Georgia? How should they be treated? Should they just be thrown away because they represent a false history? Or should they be incorporated in a new sort of more open Georgian historiography? How do you deal with a past that clearly was patently false, but which was nevertheless part of Georgia's history for decades? So, Elena, maybe you could answer that question, because you're dealing with monuments. You know, how should those monuments from the Soviet period be treated? Should they be taken down? Should they be preserved as examples of Georgia's history before independence? Maybe you could try and answer that question.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a very difficult question, and I obviously cannot answer it alone. It has to be a decision of the nation what to do with the monuments. But I can say that there are a lot of Soviet monuments. I personally have studied 342. And I've done a quantitative and a qualitative study of these monuments. There's a lot, and they are different. Some of them actually carry national narratives, and some of them are just like sculptural compositions dedicated to the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. So there are different categories of monuments, and you could let's say, start removing something that is highly regarded as national today and make some people angry. Or they could be, for example, cases of monuments that the sculptors themselves believe that have no narrative in it, but have always been perceived as either Soviet or non-Soviet. And a good example of this is Ochiauri's monument of the uprising, the rebellion, or the rebellious Guruli, because this was a case of a monument that he himself, the author, very frankly, very honestly told me, I have not put any idea in it. I just called it uprising and rebellion, but I didn't mean it to be rebellion against the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the monument got destroyed, criticized, moved and moved back and installed and reinstalled back throughout all this decade. So it's been a constant reinterpretation and interpretation of this monument, and everybody interpreted absolutely different way. The reception was different, but the author himself, he did not put this kind of meaning into this monument. So what do you do in those cases? It's a very complex question, and I think it's also really hard to put all of these monuments in one park because some of them are huge. And we had we had a case when under Saakashvili's government, one of the Soviet memorial, a big one, was destroyed, exploded, basically symbolically, we had that case. We also had case of Stalin monument removals, which stirred this kind of controversy. So I would say the closest you can see the controversy that touching some of the Soviet monuments can create, you could see that on the case of Stalin, because you got there some kind of public debate about what do we do with the Soviet monuments. But also, I mean, I was born, but I was very little back then. But when Georgia got independence, David would remember that there was also this wave of destruction of the Soviet monuments, right? David. So there were some monuments on the parliament.
I remember well.
So I would say the Georgian public had the kind of the first wave of destroying some of the Soviet monuments, and I think it's an ongoing process, and it's very hard to answer this question because these monuments are not the same. They are built during Soviet times, but they are different. They, for example, the Ochiauri soldiers got reinterpreted as a national, suffering and tragedy, and the requiem narrative that himself, the sculptor, wanted to put in it got reactivated.
But in Gori, not
in Gori.
And it's a good place for that monument, but on the other hand, where you place monuments also is extremely important, right? So, I mean, if the monument is not in a public place where it's visible,
and
its message can be lost.
Absolutely. And I would say that to start that discussion, I don't remember the name of the question's author, to start that discussion, maybe we can start by, as David suggested, by Stalin's museum, because nobody is touching that museum. And if you go in, it's the same as it was when Stalin himself designed it, right? Except for this one little basement room. I even read some studies sometimes that even some of the guides are basically telling the story the same way it was told during Soviet. I think there's an improvement right now. It's not like that, but I've even heard stories like that. So I would say that let's start with that and maybe figure out little by little. And one small comment on Steve and I agree with what you've said on the attic, but I would also say it was interesting for me because with that case we can see that the Georgian public is interested into how the Georgian government basically deals with this transferred memory and transferred basically immigrant memory that we just got back, right? So they want to care about it.
Right. Ellen, I'm sorry, going to have to interrupt because we've run out of time. Andrew, I don't think we have time because they're going to close us down after our allotted time. But I want to thank you all very much for participating in this. It was a fascinating discussion. And I'm going to try and think of some other way to continue this. But thanks again. Thanks, David, for coming in from your hotel room in Spain, and Andrew getting up early for this, and Eleanor, thank you to everybody. And good luck in your future research.